1, 2, 3.
While our weekly shows are edited to time for broadcast on public TV and community radio, we offer to our supporting members and podcast subscribers full uncut conversations. The following podcast features full uncut conversations with law professor Kimberlé Crenshaw, an American civil rights advocate and leading scholar of critical race theory. She's the co-founder of African American Policy Forum and the host of the podcast Intersectionality Matters, that includes the series States of Amnesia, The Real History of Critical Race Theory. Also, you'll hear the Uncut Conversation with Clifford Albright, the co-founder of Black Voters Matter, one of the most significant organizations working for voter rights in the U.S. Clips from both interviews are featured in our special report from Selma, where Americans marked the 60th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery marches, amidst a hail of executive orders by Trump reversing many of the gains of the civil rights movement and banning anti-discrimination measures and even the teaching of civil rights history. These audio exclusives are made possible thanks to you, our members' supporters.
I'm Kimberlé Crenshaw. I'm professor of law at Columbia and UCLA Law School, and I'm the executive director of the African American Policy Forum.
How'd you spend your day today?
Oh, my day-to-day started with a service to commemorate the fact that Bloody Sunday came at a time when Black churches were subject to an executive order from the governor not to host any civil rights meetings, any mass meetings among African Americans seeking their freedom through voting rights. One church, Brown Chapel, refused that executive order. And so as a way of honoring, commemorating their courage, the march starts with a Sunday service at the chapel, which this year was held somewhere else because the church has long been under a renovation project. And it was announced today that they're $1 million closer to that renovation. So there was a lot to celebrate, a lot to commemorate. Then we went to the march, and it was once again deeply moving, deeply energizing. Also, it raised questions about what's to come. It raised questions about what the new strategy and tactics will be. But more than anything, it was an expression of determination. And as LaTosha Brown said yesterday, we have to have moments when, as a people, we celebrate our wins. And yes, this was Bloody Sunday. Yes, there were injuries that happened. Yes, there was terror. But it's also the case that within 6 months, there was the Voting Rights Act, which is the most significant piece of civil rights legislation that has been passed. That's a victory that we have to remember, that we have to celebrate, we have to commemorate, but we also have to ask ourselves, what are we going to do in this moment of retrenchment and loss? So I think a lot of us came here because we needed to tap into that energy. We needed to feel what it feels like to be part of a mass mobilization. And we have to take that back with us for preparation and determination in the struggle that we're facing right now.
How would you compare and contrast the language of civil rights 60 years ago and our language around voting rights, democracy, civil rights today?
Well, I think 60 years ago, there was just no question that we were fighting segregation, and segregation was rationalized, justified, legitimized through anti-Black racism. Everyone understood that on both sides of the issue. So the question was, should racism be constrained, disciplined, and should freedom be unleashed by restraining anti-Black racism? That much was key. Today, there is less articulation, less recognition, less willingness to call out anti-Black racism, again, on both sides. So one of the things that really drove me, and I've been deeply concerned about, is how little attention has been paid to the way that anti-Blackness has been the engine that has fueled the descent into fascism. The idea that anybody who is not a white male is unqualified for their jobs, that originates in the idea that Black people have gotten ahead through affirmative action that has benefited unqualified people. That idea that Black people are not qualified for the jobs that they hold comes from a long history of stereotyped ideas that Black people are intellectually deficient, that Black people don't work hard, that Black people don't want the same things that everybody else does. Those ideas got attached to equal opportunity policies, to affirmative action a long, long time ago. And now they have functioned to undermine the entire infrastructure of civil rights enforcement. If we're unable to historicize what we are seeing now, if we're unable to get to the root, to the belly of how anti-Black racism has been the fuel for this, then we're not going to be able to successfully, effectively address why and how what's happening is absolutely a return to the past that everybody should be willing to repudiate.
I think the problem is that word fascism. When people think fascism, they think Germany. Part of the exercise of being here is to remember our history that people
Yes.
don't know and don't remember. Is there a problem with how we understand fascism?
Of course. I guess one of the main problems is that we don't understand racial tyranny. We don't understand racist state. We don't understand white Christian nationalism. We don't understand the period in which Reconstruction was overthrown as being an example of America's particular flavor of fascism, partly because it didn't happen to everyone. It only happened to Black people. So when we see and hear and think about fascism, we think about anti-democratic movements in Europe. We think about the Holocaust. We think about what happened in Italy and in Spain and in Portugal because it happened to people that look like us. We don't think about what happened when biracial governments in the South were overthrown and elected officials were killed when they escaped the courthouse. We don't think about voters being lynched when they go to exercise their rights to participate in government. We don't think about how the entire federal bureaucracy basically turned over the governance of Black citizens to segregationist, racist, white supremacist governments. We don't think about the tyranny that that created. But for Black people, as Langston Hughes said, you don't have to explain to us what fascism is. We experienced it. That is what we were fighting for the 60, 70 years after Reconstruction was overthrown. That was what was so significant about Selma in the 1960s, because that was the moment when at last, decades later, we were able to push back against the overthrow, against the descent into racial tyranny. That's the history that we don't tell ourselves. So that's why in this moment, when another page out of that same book is being read and performed, we don't understand it for what it is. And that, lastly, is the entire reason why the first thing that MAGA went after was history, was our words, was our ability to shape and frame and communicate what is happening. So if anyone at all is surprised right now with the long list of words that now cannot be said in our federal government, it only means you weren't paying attention. because they started this nearly a decade ago, and this is what happens when we don't know our history enough to protest the erasure of our history.
What have you found as you've talked about this here today and in the country in the last few weeks and months? As
Yeah.
you've been talking about this to a lot of people. You've been the target of a lot of this.
Well, there's some people, when I start talking about it again, they say, oh, yeah, here you go again. But with a certain recognition that this is not news or shouldn't be news. I think for others, there is clearly shock about how things have unraveled in a way that appears to be so quickly. And what I've been using as a metaphor is the fires in California and Los Angeles, because a lot of people have the sense that it just came without warning. It just popped up overnight. It was an unpredictable, horrific conflagration that burned hot and fast and furious. And what I say is that this moment might feel like it came out of nowhere, but just like the fires in California did not come out of nowhere. It came out of months and months of a drought. It came after underbrush dried over the course of months. It came after global warming, climate change created these weather patterns that made such conditions particularly dangerous. The same thing has happened with our democracy. There has been an effort to hollow out what the role of government is for a generation. There's been an effort to erase the idea of public values for a generation. There's been an effort to erase public education, the main institution that creates our sense of what it means to be an American citizen, the main institution that tells us about civics, it tells us about how government is supposed to work, that establishes the parameters of what is supposed to be our quest for democracy. Because of the role of public education as the conduit for racial equity and justice since Brown versus Board of Education, it's been on the chopping block of the far right since Brown versus Board of Education. So this is like all of that underbrush that's just been sitting around waiting for the spark. And the spark in our democracy right now that is burning it to the core is Trumpism. So it didn't happen overnight. The question that we all have to ask is, were there opportunities for us to deal with that underbrush? Did we see it and think it's not going to affect us? Did we hear about it burning some neighborhood down like critical race theory or Black history or 1619 and think, that's not really going to get to us at any point soon? We have to be honest and ask ourselves, what were the signs that we missed? Because if we ask ourselves that, we will be in a better position to go back to those battles and draw the line there to push back against the further encroachment and, frankly, the deterioration of our democracy.
So what does power look like in this moment to do any of the things that you just described?
Well, so one of the things that I think we have learned now from the MAGA takeover of local governments is that power is local. Power is in our story. Power is in our narrative. Power is making sure that no power is left on the table. And all too often, I think that the civil rights story and the civil rights legacy has been projected purely as a national or federal project. And as a consequence, we haven't been as activated and motivated to get involved on the local level. So a lot of this underbrush that's been dried out, it happened at the local level, taking over school boards, taking over county commissioners, taking over city councils, and then taking over state legislatures. That's where even the victories that we are able to get on a local level get overturned at the state level or in the governor's office. So power is closer to where the people are than we have been led to believe when we are called to action only every 4 years for a presidential campaign, or at best when we're called to action every 2 years for midterms. But the focus still is on the national story and not so much on the local, where most of the decisions that shape our lives are made. So now I think we have more of a sense of people thinking, how did this get out of control? Where have I lost focus? And people are becoming more focused on the local level. And at the same time, there has to be a recognition that these things are more connected than we think they are. There's been an emergency now around the state of our democracy, but a lot of people who talk about the state of our democracy don't talk about racism and the erasure of voting rights. We have to understand that our multiracial democracy and anti-racism in American history are two sides of the same coin. Whenever we have lost democratic rights, it has been through the weaponization of racism. Whenever we have gained racial justice, it's been a gain for everyone. When we lose sight of that, that becomes the parting of the waters that allows MAGA Trumpism to march into our capital and do more destruction than the Confederates did during the Civil War. That's what we're facing now.
Can you imagine 60 years from now and what they may tell of us today? What story they may tell of this?
I can imagine a couple stories, and I want to do everything possible so that they know the real story. If I look forward 60 years, I can imagine two different stories, and it depends on whether we learned the lesson of the last time we nearly lost our democracy. So the last time we nearly lost our democracy was the Civil War. And as my friend Brian Stevenson says all the time, the Union may have won the war, but the South won the narrative. What do we mean by that? The South won the narrative that the war was an honorable war. The South won the narrative that it was a senseless conflict over a set of issues that we shouldn't have fought over. The South won the war by convincing the Union to throw the interests of African Americans under the bus. It took us decades to recover from the lost cause narrative of the Civil War. And we finally were able to overcome dimensions of it through the Civil Rights Act, through the courage of people that we are here today in Selma to celebrate. So we know that history can be rewritten to elevate those who tried to break the country rather than share it, and to denigrate those who actually put their lives on the line to save democracy. So 60 years from now, we could be rehearsing that same story. It could be that the attack on January 6th was a patriotic effort to take our country back. It could be that this Trump presidency was the presidency that put us on the right track. It could be that the Supreme Court and Congress bowing to the president is exactly what needed to happen to save America for those who are seen as valuable. I hope that's not the story 60 years from now. I hope the story 60 years from now is we came to the precipice, we saw disaster below, and finally we decided to connect the dots, understand that this democracy is for all of us, and understand what we needed to do to save it. I know what I'm going to do is make sure there's a record of this moment. So whatever happens in 60 years, it cannot be said that it was not known what happened. It cannot be said it was simply a product of the time. It cannot be said that there were no people who were protesting it. And it cannot be said that people didn't know for sure that this fight was not a fight for the next 4 years. It's not a fight for the next 8 years. It is a fight for the next century. I want to be sure that people in the next century knew that we know that now.
How do we fight? Any advice on how we fight?
Well, one of the things that I'm doing constantly is trying to share information in ways that fight the disinformation. And that is hard now when most people get their information from some of the sources and some of the beneficiaries of the plutocracy, of the upward distribution of wealth. So we have to go about actually doing things that we haven't done in a long time, which is why I'm here in Selma. I could have read about it. I could have tweeted about it. I could have TikToked about it. But there's nothing to substitute the presence of being with people in movement together. And I am so glad I came. And I'm committing to doing as much as I can in person because that is what got us here. Right? That's what gave people the courage to march over that bridge together. It wasn't just picking up the phone, and it clearly wasn't doing the things we do now because they didn't even have those capabilities. So in person, real organizing, in my view, is the only thing that allows us to speak, allows us to have uninterrupted connection that leads us to the next level. And the other thing that I think is just, it's simple, but I think it's important. We just can't be quiet. I can't tell you how important it's been for me to hear how many people say, I thought I was alone, or I thought there were just a handful of us. I'm so moved to be able to see that we run in the hundreds of thousands, millions of people who are appalled at what is happening, are shocked, and are determined not to allow this to be our legacy. But if we don't know how strong we are, we will buy the hype. We will accept the stories that we hear about how many people are so afraid that they're not saying anything. We have to be that example, and when we are that example, we find that there are legions in concert with us. That is just what we have to be doing far more of, because the most important weapon that the other side has is the image, the illusion that they are all powerful. And the only way that we can fight that is to speak out against it. There's only one guarantee right now. The only guarantee is we will not win if we don't fight. That's it, and that's all of it.
That was the full uncut interview with law professor Kimberlé Crenshaw, the co-founder of African American Policy Forum. Next up is the full uncut interview with Clifford Albright, co-founder of Black Voters Matter. Clips from both interviews are featured in our special report from Selma, where Americans mark the 60th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery marches. You can watch it at our website, lauraflanders.org, and also find out where and when it's airing on public TV and on community radio. That episode will also be available here in this podcast feed, so be sure to hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts. And now, Clifford Albright.
I'm Cliff Albright. I am co-founder and executive director of Black Voters Matter. We're in Selma, Selma, Alabama, historic Selma. Today is the Bloody Sunday commemorative march that takes place every year. This is the 60th anniversary of that march, and so, a particularly important milestone. And we're sitting here in a building that actually is kind of like a museum to the march and an organizing space for people that are coming to learn about that Selma history. And so for me, it's like, and for me and my wife and my friend and partner, Latasha Brown, it's like coming home because Latasha's literally from Selma. My wife, April, and I, we lived in Selma for 10 years. And so this is always like a coming home feeling for us. We often say that like Black Voters Matter's origin story is in Selma. Both in terms of like a specific election that first got us involved in electoral organizing, because when I first moved here in 1998 and when my wife first moved here, we both weren't actually into electoral organizing. We actually had some of the same critiques that we hear today when we go out into the streets, people saying, oh, it doesn't work. They take us for granted. It's just deepening us into a system that's not for us. Like, those are the things that we said and believed when we first moved to Selma. But as organizers, what we knew is we can't be in Selma and not actually be involved in electoral organizing. So we got involved, and in the year 2000, there was an important mayor's election where we got rid of Mayor Joe T. Smillerman, who had been mayor in Selma ever since Bloody Sunday. So he had been, in the year 2000, he had been mayor for 37 years. And so when we organized in that election, it was a campaign called Joe Gotta Go. And that night, in fact, I was just around the corner from here, I think. That night when the election results started to come in and it was announced, traffic stopped on all of Broad Street, which is like the main street that leads to the bridge. Just like traffic stopped. People got out of their cars, got on top of cars. People were dancing and singing, crying tears. Like I had never seen anything. It was like a post Super Bowl celebration. And I remember I looked around, and I was with Latasha, we looked around, and I said to myself, if we can do this electoral thing right, if we can do it in a way that connects elections not just to a process but to people's issues, if we can unleash people's sense of their power that can create this kind of celebration, if we can do that, then we can make some magic happen, in this city, in this state, and in this country. And it was that night that conceptually, at least, that Black Voters Matter started. It would be another 16 years before we started on paper, and then another year after that before we'd have the Alabama election of Doug Jones and Roy Moore in 2017. But the seeds of that started right here in Selma in that 2000 election, and in the ways that we organized throughout that whole period when we were living here.
What do you define as the major challenges we're facing in 2025?
Yeah, oh no, it definitely feels like we've gone backwards. We got a lot of challenges right now, and I think one of the biggest challenges is just getting people to understand the type of moment that we're in. Because there's still a sense among some folk that it's bad, but it's like within the normal range of bad. And what we've been trying to communicate to folks is this is not normal, right? This is not just a case of a bad administration with bad policies. This is not just a matter of thinking that whether the tax rate should be 20% or 25%, or this isn't that. This is fundamentally somebody coming in who's telling us that we're not going to have any elections, who's telling us that he can just fire people that really cannot be fired, or that he can get rid of entire agencies that were legislatively created agencies that he can't just fire on his own, thinking that he can actually be a king or a dictator, which he's told us is what he admires in the past. Like he goes to these other countries and he's like, I want the kind of powers that they have in China. I want a military parade, right? I want generals that just serve me. So he's told us who he is, and now we're seeing that it's actually being acted on. There's a real question around whether or not he's going to respect Supreme Court decisions or any court decisions. Like, that's not something that we've necessarily faced in this country. And so this is a critical moment. And so we're trying to get people to understand that we can't fight fascism with the same tools that we've been using just to do basic electoral organizing. We're not going to phone bank our way out of this. We're not going to text our way out of this. And in truth, we're not even going to vote our way out of this. It's going to take a different level of organizing, some different strategies. It's going to take revisiting some of the same strategies that we saw here in Selma in terms of nonviolent civil disobedience and direct action. If we're not prepared for that, then we're not prepared for this moment.
One of the struggles we're having is around history.
Yeah.
So a lot of people don't even know what it was that the organizers here 60 years ago were up against.
Yeah.
Contests and
Yeah.
were operating level of violence, no access to any kind of power. When you think about what they were up against,
Yeah.
and compare it to what we're up against,
Yeah.
what's the story that you tell?
The first story that I have to tell is that there were people who didn't want to come to Selma to organize. There was a local movement that had been taking place for decades, and I think that's important for people to understand. It didn't start when Dr. King or SCLC showed up. So there had been a local movement, but SNCC and SCLC had not been involved in large part to basically summarize the feeling at the time. They said that the white folks are too mean and the black folks are too scared. And so it wasn't until after the Birmingham bombing, the 4 little girls, that some of the workers said, just out of the pain and frustration and the defiance, they said, you know what, we're going to Selma. And so that's when the movement went to like kind of this next level. But, when we look at what they were up against, that level of You had a Sheriff Jim Clark, who was the Dallas County Sheriff. You had obviously the governor, who was full-blown segregationist, right? When you look at the forces that they were up against, and the lack of attention and the lack of support, when you look at the battles that Dr. King and others were having with the White House, with Lyndon B. Johnson, who just kept saying, now's not the time for a Voting Rights Act. When you look at all of those forces, the fact that 600 people, were able to that day go and start that march and even get to the top of the bridge, and you just have to kind of imagine it, right? Because people know the photo of John Lewis in the front line standing, face to face with the troopers, but that's not the first time they saw the troopers. When they got to the top of the bridge, they saw the wave of troopers that were waiting on them. And so for that whole way down the bridge until they got to the foot, they're knowing this is not going to end well. But they still went forward, right? And so when we look at those forces that they were up against, we're up against some of the same forces today. We're up against police forces that are being told from the White House that basically anything goes. He said that he wants to give police complete immunity, not qualified immunity, but absolute immunity. He's actually pardoned police officers that have been involved in murder and corruption. Obviously we know that he's pardoned the January 6th people. And so there's a green light that's being given to political violence, right? It's worse than just when he said to the Proud Boys, stand by and stand back and stand by. He's basically saying, go get them, right? And so this is the context that we're up against now. And in some ways, it's worse because what we at least had in 1965 was once they got the federal court order that said that the march could go forward, right, after Bloody Sunday, that's what let the actual march happen from Selma to Montgomery. It happened because there was a court order that said they can march. And the federal government and the state obeyed that court order. What would happen today if that same court order was given, right? Would this administration obey it? Would this administration send National Guard or federal troops to enforce that court order? Or would they do the exact opposite and send federal troops to say, we're not going to obey this court order? Trump has basically said that. Like, if I don't obey, what you gonna do to me? You gonna arrest me? Well, we know they're not gonna do that, right? And so we're in a real crisis here in terms of how we organize and what we're up against. And again, it's not necessarily the same as what we've been through before. We've been through a lot of bad before, but this particular dynamic is really fundamentally different than anything we've seen really since Reconstruction. I mean, I think power still looks like the way that it's always looked like, right? It looks like the power of our convictions. It looks like the power of our love for each other and how far and how willing are we to use with the power that we have to make that love go forward, right? It looks like Al Green standing, pointing his cane and saying, no, you do not have a mandate to cut Medicaid, right? When you don't have, it even looks like, and some people are critical of when they stood on the floor of the House with Al Green for the censure vote and started singing "We Shall Overcome," and some people say, oh, there you go, singing that song again, right? But the fact of the matter is, by standing there together and singing that song, what happened? They literally stopped the process, and they had to put Congress in recess. And Mike Johnson got frustrated because his gavel didn't have power. So when you don't have the power that you want, you've got to use the power that you have. And in that moment, that's the power that they have. And we are all going to have to answer that question. What is the power that we have? It might be my voice, it might be my body, it might be my ability to sit in, it might be my ability to provide funding for the movement and for direct action. It might be the artwork that I'm able to do or the food that I'm able to cook or just my messaging, right? So that as people engage in direct action, that we don't have a narrative built up around them that calls them outside agitators and calls them extremists, right? It may just be that I help to shape that narrative to make sure that we are all on the same page about why this is necessary in this moment. So we still have that power. We have the power of our convictions and the power, power at its best, as Dr. King said, is love implementing the demands of justice. We've got that power. We've just got to be very clear about the best ways to use it. And that is going to take us being grounded in these philosophies, grounded in this strategy and these tactics, and then having the courage to move forward. Which doesn't mean that we may not be scared, right? It's okay to have fear. The people here on that bridge had fear, but they moved forward in spite of that fear. And in doing so, they changed history. That's the power that we have today.
Thanks for taking the time to listen to the full conversations with law professor Kimberlé Crenshaw, the co-founder of African American Policy Forum, and Clifford Albright, co-founder of Black Voters Matter. Clips from both are featured in our special report from Selma, where Americans mark the 60th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery marches. You can watch that episode at our website and airing on public TV. In addition, this Laura Flanders and Friends special report will air on community radio and be available as a podcast in the coming week. These audio exclusives are made possible thanks to our member supporters. Please join our members now by making a one-time donation or make it monthly by becoming a Patreon partner. All the details are at lauraflanders.org. And thanks again to all our member supporters.